Hey, good morning, folks. This is Mark Heilshorn. I am a pastor and a theologian, and I come to you live this morning to speak about Paul's letter to the Galatian community, which talks about the fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of the Spirit. Really happy to have you here today. I've been thinking about the fruits of the Spirit now for about a month, broadcasting here and there about what they mean. And I'm just going to review the 9 of them, just so you have an understanding. And they begin with love and joy and peace and patience and gentleness and kindness and faithfulness. And the one that we're going to be discussing tonight is called self-control. Self-control. I meant this morning, self-control. So you got to remember that Paul is writing to a community, the first century Christians who are trying very hard to understand the life of Jesus and the messaging that he gave to the communities of the Gentiles and the communities of faith in that first century after his death. And Paul, of course, was not a disciple. He was an apostle. He did not know Jesus. But he was certainly in a conversion place, having seen the light on the road to Emmaus, and now is an apostle for Christ. So he's talking about these aspects of living, the spiritual living, that frankly are shared by many, many faith traditions. And the concept of self-control is a really interesting one because, and I know I struggle with it. I struggle with self-control because I'm human. I'm human. I make mistakes. I get mad at people. I respond. I react instead of responding. And it is probably going to be a lifelong journey to live out what it means to be embraced by the gifts and the fruits of the Spirit. So, but when I think of the self-control, I often think of a show that I used to watch when I was a kid called Lost in Space. And many of you who are in my generation will remember Lost in Space and Will Robinson. You'll also recall the fact that there was a robot on that spaceship that always flailed his arms and spun his head around, and all kinds of lights went off where his brain necessarily was, where he was computing things, and it was always saying, "Danger, Will Robinson, danger, danger, danger." And, they were spinning off into some black hole or headed into an asteroid field, or something tragic was about to happen. And the robot was the sensitive one. He was aware of when all these things were going to come to pass. And I think of self-control. Saw self-control as the antidote to being lost in space and lost in ourselves and lost in our egos and lost in our resentments and lost in our anger and lost in our bitterness and lost in our confusion. Right. And let's face it, there's plenty of that going on right now. I mean, needless to say, we are stuck in the COVID crisis as we know it. We are stuck in bigotry and racism that's really, quite frankly, been going on for generations, and we're finally addressing it again. And we're stuck in a place where we really have to look hard at ourselves and our motives and what drives us. And we can easily slip out of the fruits of the Spirit. We can easily find ourselves not loving, not feeling very joyful, not being patient, not being kind, not being gentle, not being faithful, not being forgiving, and certainly losing our self-control. I think we're seeing that just about everywhere, and it's a reality of our times. So what does it mean? What does it mean to lose control? It means that we're a slave to what controls us, right? And when we're a slave to what controls us, we are really reacting to the world around us, and we're not demonstrating these fruits of the Spirit, and we're not living in the concept of self-control. And there's lots of ways we lose ourselves. We lose ourselves in food. We've got an obese country. We've got an obese world, right? So when we're stressed and we're out of control, we eat. It's comfort food, so we eat. And it's a big problem for many people. We get lost in lust. I mean, look at all the pornography that's out there, all the sexualization of women and men, quite frankly, in this culture, and what it means to be perfect, what it means to be polite, what it means to be suave, what it means to be attractive. It's a very lustful culture. We get lost in our addictions. We drink a lot. We take drugs. We smoke. We collectively, I think, as a culture, just get lost in what it means to want to take the edge off of everything and not deal with the reality of life. So we find ways, as it were, to totally lose control. We get lost in the money world. Boy, it is the epicenter of most of our lives. The money that we have, the money that we earn, the money that we spend. I mean, everything is money, 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 money. I feel like we're still living in, the Christmas Carol, where the Scrooge is just about everywhere. So we get lost in our words. We get lost in the violence that we see. We are slaves to apathy. We're slaves to power and authority and senses of entitlement and self-righteousness. We're slaves to the kind of skin that we happened to be born with. We think of ourselves as being better than others and superior than others. We become slaves to that. We become slaves to our sense of privilege. And in this day and age, we have to be especially aware of the fact that if we're able, if we're educated, if we're white, if we're male, and if we're deemed wealthy, we represent 1% of the world. And we kind of have to recognize that and at least be aware of it and be humble enough to see that we have advantages that others don't. We just do. So, we can easily find ourselves overwhelmed with the consequences of not having self-control in many, many areas of our life. And these things can move us into extreme behaviors and extreme attitudes, and not very godly, frankly, and not very thoughtful, and not very caring, and not very kind. We are not necessarily paying attention to the people who aren't just like us. So self-control is a means to pause, pull back, not react to things, and to recognize what's happening in our energy bodies when something is irritating us and something doesn't feel quite right. And instead of jumping out of our skin and getting mad and reacting, what's so important these days, is to really, sorry about that, my phone just rang, is to recognize when those sensations are being triggered and to pull back and say, okay, what's really going on here? All right. So, it's worth also recognizing that the very foundation of being able to get away from this sort of loose living and this lack of self-control is the ability to live a selfless life, one that reflects our sense of what Jesus must have been like, where he gave and he gave and he gave to people. He didn't sit around and judge everybody. He accepted people for who they are, but he continued to give, and he continued to give glory to God in everything that he was all about. So a couple of things that I've watched recently, a couple of movies that I think really speak to this concept of self-control is one about Nelson Mandela, who was the leader of South Africa back in the 90s. He was in jail for 20 some odd years fighting apartheid, and finally got out and became the leader of that nation. And his ability to have tolerance and patience in an environment that was hostile towards his skin, hostile towards his race, and the amount of bigotry and narcissism and entitlement that he had to put up with in order to be the president of that country and overcome the difficulties of being a minority figure that was leading a nation that 2 decades before had condemned him to the slavery of a prison. An extraordinary story, and the movie's called Invictus, and I highly recommend it, and I would encourage and invite everybody to see that film. Beautiful story about a beautiful man. And Desmond Tutu, who played a significant role in that movie as well. Many of you know that I met Mother Teresa and knew her. I can't think of anybody more who embodied self-control more, given the fact that she was a woman, she was a nun, and yet from the time that she started her order in the 1930s until her death in the 1990s, she established 1,000 Sisters of Charity and made big changes in the world. And probably had to put up with a lot, and the self-control that she must have been able to give to God through prayer. I can only imagine the troubles and the challenges that she had to demonstrate the ability to be prayerful and godly in everything that she did. Another great movie that I watched last night is the story of the March to Montgomery from Selma, which features certainly Martin Luther King's march in the 1965, where he marched from the atrocities and the violence that was taking place in Selma, and dealing with the bigotry and the segregation and the racism of Alabama, which, as we all know, does still exist today. The South really has not given up a lot of its bigotry. And quite frankly, it's not just the South. It's all across the country, and it's all across the world. The marginalized attitudes we have towards those who have a different color and come from a different race is atrocious, in my view, and completely denies the fact that we are all one. We're all one in God's eyes. And how we can't see that as a people has a lot to do with the fact that we're not living as a godly people throughout the world. And these fruits of the Spirit remind us of what it means to be open and aligned and loving of all people: white, black, female, male, gay, straight, adult, child. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. And there are no boundaries around these fruits of the Spirit. So I invite you to think about all these things and be thoughtful and caring of certainly this one, self-control. And it's a tough one. It's a tough one when we're feeling pressure, when we're feeling stress, when we're anxious about what's happening in the world, when we're being told that we have to change our ways in order to protect ourselves from disease, but also to recognize that the marginalized are the ones that get hurt the most in extreme situations like we're in. And that raises the issues from below to the surface, and that's actually not such a bad thing. Or having to look at things very differently, and it's okay. It's okay. So let's get into a prayerful place, a meditative place, and just be thoughtful. And in this meditation, I want you to picture. What it means to feel the sun. We are in that place where we're feeling the sun on this June 19th day, this Juneteenth experience where we're celebrating the emancipation of slaves in the South, and the sunlight and the energy that comes from the warmth of the sun, and feel like that's God's energy pouring down around us and helping everything to grow and helping everything to be seen. And in this meditation, just think of yourself being basked by God's grace, God's light, God's warmth, God's compassion, and God's love. And see yourself as a prism that reflects that light onto the lives of others. Think of how you spread that light, that kaleidoscope of colors, onto the people around you, your spouses, your children, your animals, your parents, your siblings, your grandparents, your friends, and certainly on people that we don't even know, people who are on the front lines still and will be for a long time. doctors and nurses and policemen, and firemen and women who are doing the best they can to be patient and kind and tolerant, and to not react to what's happening around them, but to respond in kind with patience and tolerance and love. It is a tall order. It is a tall order, both for civil society and for those who've been asked to be the protectors of that society. And help us to just find the ability to be kind and patient with ourselves, because we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to jump to conclusions. We're all going to react. So help yourself find the ability to respond to everything that happens across the paper today and in the world and on television. And to take a deep breath and recognize that, you know what? I'm fine. And my soul is asking me to relax and know that God is here, and God has always been here. And to help us live with the feeling that we are but agents of God's grace, disciples, apostles, sources of connection where people will look to us for finding the balance in life that they need. So feel that. I invite you to live it and to spread it in all that you do. Let's close with a prayer. God, help us to demonstrate self-control, to be calm, to dissolve fear, and to reclaim the spirit of our lives, and to be and embody the gifts and the fruits of the Spirit that Paul tried so hard to demonstrate in his life to the Christian communities he served. We may be the only Spirit that somebody sees. We may be the only Bible that somebody reads. We may be the only model that somebody looks to for how to live a life. So be careful what you say. Help us to be the embodiment, to be the love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the thankfulness, the caring, the gentleness, the goodness, and to live out self-control in our lives this day and always. Love you all. Thanks for spending time with me this morning, and we'll move into a whole nother segment as we move forward with these podcasts. That's kind of being designed as we speak. Okay. Have a great day. Thanks.